Blowout. This video is based on key insights from the book Blowout by Rachel Maddow. Introduction. Rachel Maddow begins her story with a surprising scene: the grand opening of a small gas station in New York City in 2003, attended by none other than Russian President Vladimir Putin. This event, she argues, seemed unbelievable at the time. A strange detour for a world leader amidst important meetings with other powerful figures like George W. Bush and the leaders of France and Germany. Maddow uses this unusual event as a starting point to explore a much larger and troubling story about the connection between oil, gas, Russia, and the weakening of democracy. The author highlights the contrast between Putin's high-level diplomatic engagements and his appearance at a local business opening. He had been participating in serious discussions about global issues, remembering the victims of 9/11 and meeting with world leaders. Yet, he chose to spend time promoting a Russian-owned gas station chain in the United States. This seemingly insignificant event, Maddow explains, was actually a carefully planned move by Russia's Lukoil, a massive oil company, to enter the American market. It wasn't just about selling gas. It was about establishing a foothold and demonstrating Russia's growing economic power. Maddow details how Lukoil acquired Getty Petroleum, gaining control of hundreds of gas stations on the East Coast. This allowed them to modernize these stations, making them more attractive to customers. The author points out that this expansion wasn't necessarily about making a profit, but about making a statement. It was a way for Russia to show its influence and challenge the dominance of American oil companies. The author emphasizes that this move was symbolic, representing Russia's ambition to become a major player in the global economy and a competitor to the United States. The author then shifts focus to the larger context of the early 2000s, a time when oil prices were rising and concerns about dependence on Middle Eastern oil were growing. Russia, with its vast oil reserves, presented itself as an alternative supplier. Putin offered the United States a partnership, promising a stable source of energy in exchange for investment and modernization of Russia's oil infrastructure. This offer, Maddow suggests, was appealing to the Bush administration, but it also carried risks. Maddow introduces Vagit Alekbarov, the CEO of Lukoil, as a key figure in this story. He was a dedicated patriot who understood the geopolitical importance of Russia's oil industry. Alekbarov believed that Lukoil's success was tied to the success of Russia, and he was willing to prioritize national interests over pure profit. The author explains that this mindset, while understandable, also meant that Lukoil was willing to operate in ways that might not be entirely transparent or ethical. The author describes a tense meeting between Putin and Lee Raymond, the CEO of ExxonMobil, at the New York Stock Exchange. Raymond demanded control over any future investments in a Russian oil company called Yukos. This encounter, Maddow argues, revealed a fundamental conflict of interest. Putin wanted to maintain control over Russia's oil industry, while Western oil companies wanted to maximize their profits, even if it meant undermining Russia's sovereignty. This clash of interests, the author suggests, laid the groundwork for future conflicts. Maddow points out that Putin's initial optimism about a partnership with the West began to fade, as he realized the extent to which Western companies were willing to exploit Russia's resources. The author suggests that Putin became increasingly distrustful of the West and more determined to protect Russia's interests, even if it meant resorting to authoritarian tactics. This shift in Putin's thinking, Maddow argues, had profound consequences for both Russia and the world. The author concludes by noting that the Lukoil gas station on 24th Street and 10th Avenue is now gone, replaced by luxury condos. The promise of a new era of cooperation between Russia and the United States never materialized. Instead, relations between the two countries have deteriorated, and Russia has become increasingly isolated. Maddow argues that this outcome was not inevitable, but it was a direct result of the complex interplay between oil, gas, and political power. She sets the stage for a broader exploration of how the oil and gas industry has corrupted democracy and fueled global instability. The author suggests that the story of that small gas station in New York City is a microcosm of a much larger and more dangerous trend. Section 1. This section covers chapters 1 to 3 in the book. Rachel Maddow begins a sweeping story with a single point. The beginning of America's incredible rise to power can be traced back to a single oil well drilled in Pennsylvania in 1859. It wasn't just about finding oil, though. It was about what happened after that oil was found. The author explains that this discovery sparked a chain of events that would change the world, and it all started with a simple drill bit and a steam engine. Maddow quickly points out that while the initial amount of oil found was small, it was the beginning of something huge. She emphasizes that the United States was the first to really figure out how to make a business out of oil, from getting it out of the ground to refining it and selling it. This wasn't just about technology, it was about building an entire industry. The author highlights that the United States didn't just discover oil, it invented the whole system around it. The story then focuses on John D. Rockefeller and his company, Standard Oil. Maddow describes Rockefeller as a key figure in shaping not just the oil industry, but also the idea of American capitalism. He wasn't interested in just drilling for oil. He wanted to control the refining process, which is where the real money was. Rockefeller's success wasn't just about being smart, it was about being ruthless. He built a monopoly, meaning he controlled almost the entire oil market, and he wasn't afraid to use questionable tactics to stay on top. The author explains that Rockefeller's company became so powerful that it seemed beyond the reach of the government. Maddow details how Standard Oil's main product was kerosene, which was a big improvement over the lighting options available at the time. Kerosene was cleaner, brighter, and cheaper than whale oil or coal oil, and it quickly became popular. This demand fueled Standard Oil's growth and allowed it to expand its reach around the world. The author notes that Rockefeller's success wasn't just about providing a good product. It was about creating a demand for it and then controlling the supply. The author explains that Standard Oil's dominance eventually led to a legal battle with the U.S. government. The Supreme Court ruled that the company was a monopoly and ordered it to be broken up. However, even after the breakup, the pieces of Standard Oil continued to thrive, and many of today's major oil companies can trace their roots back to Rockefeller's empire. Maddow emphasizes that the traits of Standard Oil, a focus on efficiency, a willingness to take risks, and a distrust of government regulation, continue to shape the oil industry today. Maddow then shifts the focus to the technological innovations that have driven the oil industry forward. She highlights the story of the Koch family, who made their fortune by developing a better way to make gasoline from crude oil, and Howard Hughes, who made his money with a new type of drill bit. These innovations show that the oil industry is always looking for new ways to extract more oil, even in difficult conditions. The author then dives into a surprising chapter in the history of oil extraction. The U.S. government's attempt to use nuclear bombs to get more gas out of the ground in the 1960s. Project Rulison, as it was called, was based on the idea that a nuclear explosion could fracture shale rock and release trapped natural gas. While the experiment did release some gas, it also raised concerns about radioactivity and ultimately proved to be too expensive and dangerous to be practical. Maddow uses this story to illustrate the lengths to which people will go to find new sources of energy. Maddow then explains how the energy crisis of the 1970s led to a renewed interest in unconventional sources of natural gas, like shale gas. She focuses on George Mitchell, an independent oilman who pioneered the techniques of hydraulic fracturing, fracking, and horizontal drilling. These techniques allowed companies to access vast reserves of natural gas that were previously unreachable. The author details how Mitchell overcame skepticism and technical challenges to make fracking a viable technology. The author then turns to Russia and the story of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, an oil tycoon who challenged the power of Vladimir Putin. Maddow describes how Khodorkovsky built Yukos into the most successful oil company in Russia by adopting Western business practices and investing in new technology. However, his success also made him a target for Putin, who saw him as a threat to his authority. Khodorkovsky was arrested and imprisoned, and his company was seized by the Russian government. Maddow uses this story to illustrate the dangers of doing business in Russia and the lengths to which Putin will go to maintain control. Maddow explains how Putin used the seizure of Yukos to strengthen the state's control over the oil industry. She details how the Russian government, through the company Rosneft, acquired Yukos' assets and became a major player in the global oil market. The author highlights the role of American investment banks, like Morgan Stanley, in helping Rosneft raise capital and expand its operations. Maddow suggests that these banks were willing to overlook Putin's authoritarian tactics in pursuit of profits. The author concludes by suggesting that the story of oil is not just about energy. It's about power, corruption, and the struggle for control. Section 2. This section covers chapters 4 to 6 in the book. Rachel Maddow paints a picture of how deeply connected the oil and gas industry is to American politics, and how that connection can sometimes be, well, a little messy. She starts by pointing out that while the industry seems rough and tumble, a lot of the real power players aren't the roughnecks themselves, but accountants and financial types. These are the people who really understand how to make money in the oil business and how to influence the rules to their advantage. The story of Aubrey McClendon, a key figure in the shale gas boom, is a perfect example. Maddow details how McClendon, even as a student, was captivated by stories of oil wildcatters striking it rich. He wasn't necessarily drawn to the technical side of oil, but to the financial possibilities. This focus on profit and a willingness to bend the truth to make a good story became hallmarks of his career. He wasn't afraid to exaggerate or embellish, as long as it helped him achieve his goals. Maddow then dives into the history of McClendon's family connection to the oil industry, tracing it back to his great-uncle, a founder of Kerma-G. This wasn't just a business, it was a pathway to political power. Robert S. Kerr used his oil wealth to become a governor and then a senator, wielding significant influence in Washington. He openly used his position to benefit the oil industry, even handing out stock tips to colleagues. This established a pattern of oil money influencing politics that continued for decades, with tax breaks and favorable regulations becoming commonplace. Maddow points out these tax breaks have been in place for almost a century, making it the longest-running welfare program in the nation's history. McClendon himself followed a similar path, building a company, Chesapeake Energy, through aggressive land acquisition and borrowing. He wasn't afraid to take risks, and he benefited from a period of rising natural gas prices. But even when things got tough, he continued to push forward, fueled by his own confidence and a belief in the potential of shale gas. He was a master salesman, convincing investors and politicians alike of his vision. Maddow highlights how McClendon's success was intertwined with the revitalization of Oklahoma City. The shale gas boom brought money and jobs to the city, and McClendon became a local hero, investing in everything from sports arenas to cancer treatment centers. However, this boom also came with a sense of unchecked ambition and a willingness to cut corners. The author notes that McClendon's enthusiasm sometimes got him into trouble, like when he openly stated he didn't buy the company to keep it in Seattle, leading to a fine. But even then, he remained undeterred, continuing to promote his vision of a natural gas-fueled future. This is where the story begins to touch on the idea of corrupted democracy. McClendon wasn't shy about using his wealth and influence to shape the political landscape, and he wasn't always concerned with transparency or honesty. The arrival of ExxonMobil into the shale gas market, through the acquisition of XTO Energy, is presented as a turning point. Maddow details how ExxonMobil, under Rex Tillerson, initially dismissed shale gas as unprofitable, but then made a massive investment once it became clear that the technology was viable. Tillerson's testimony before Congress is a key moment, as he downplayed the environmental risks of fracking and emphasized the economic benefits. he skillfully navigated questions about safety and regulation, presenting ExxonMobil as a responsible actor while protecting the company's interests. Maddow suggests that Tillerson's approach was part of a broader pattern of the oil industry, using its wealth and influence to shape public policy. The industry spent millions on lobbying and campaign contributions, and it was able to successfully resist efforts to impose stricter regulations on fracking. This, Maddow implies, is a form of corrupted democracy, where the interests of a powerful industry outweigh the concerns of the public. The author suggests that the industry's ability to influence politicians and shape the narrative around energy policy has had a lasting impact on the country's energy future. Section 3. This section covers chapters 7 to 9 in the book. Rachel Maddow meticulously details a complex web connecting oil industry profits, political influence, and international corruption, particularly focusing on ExxonMobil under the leadership of Rex Tillerson. The narrative begins in April 2010, highlighting the irony of Tillerson receiving a civic award for international contributions while simultaneously engaging in practices that undermined good governance globally. Maddow illustrates how the pursuit of oil wealth often trumps concerns for democracy and ethical conduct, especially in countries with weak institutions. The author explains how the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, while a disaster in itself, served as a distraction from the larger, systemic issues at play. While the world focused on the environmental catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico, ExxonMobil continued expanding its operations in countries like Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea, where corruption and human rights abuses were rampant. Maddow emphasizes that these operations weren't accidental. They were a calculated business strategy. The oil industry, she argues, isn't equipped to clean up its own messes, and often relies on governments to overlook problematic practices in the pursuit of energy security. Maddow then turns her attention to Equatorial Guinea, a small African nation rich in oil but plagued by poverty and authoritarian rule. She details how the Obiang family, led by President Teodoro Obiang Mbasogo, amassed immense wealth while the majority of the population suffered. The author explains how Western oil companies, including ExxonMobil, knowingly contributed to this corruption by paying inflated prices and engaging in questionable financial dealings with the Obiang regime. This created a system where the pursuit of oil profits directly fueled political repression and economic inequality. The narrative highlights the role of American lobbying and political influence in enabling this situation. Maddow points out how the U.S. government, eager to secure oil supplies after 9/11, turned a blind eye to the abuses in Equatorial Guinea. She details how the Obiang regime hired American lobbyists and public relations firms to improve its image and counter criticism. This illustrates how money can be used to distort perceptions and shield corrupt regimes from accountability. Maddow then focuses on Teodorin Obiang, the president's son, and his extravagant lifestyle funded by stolen oil revenues. She describes his lavish spending on luxury cars, yachts, and real estate, showcasing the stark contrast between his wealth and the poverty of his countrymen. The author explains how Teodorin used shell companies and intermediaries to hide his assets and evade scrutiny. This exemplifies the lengths to which corrupt officials will go to protect their ill-gotten gains. The author introduces the efforts of Senator Richard Lugar and Senator Ben Cardin to introduce transparency measures into the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Section 1504 of the Act required oil and gas companies to disclose their payments to foreign governments, aiming to expose corruption and promote accountability. Maddow details the fierce opposition from the oil industry, led by ExxonMobil and Rex Tillerson, who feared that transparency would harm their business interests. Maddow recounts a tense meeting between Tillerson and Lugar, where the ExxonMobil CEO reportedly became angry and argued that the transparency rule would disadvantage the company, particularly in its dealings with Russia. This reveals the oil industry's willingness to prioritize profits over ethical considerations and its close ties to authoritarian regimes. The author underscores that the pursuit of oil often leads to compromises with undemocratic governments and a disregard for human rights. The chapter concludes by demonstrating how the oil and gas industry's pursuit of profit often clashes with democratic principles and good governance, creating a system where corruption thrives and accountability is elusive. Section 4. This section covers chapters 10 to 12 in the book. Rachel Maddow meticulously builds a narrative revealing a disturbing pattern connecting seemingly unrelated events. A surge in unusual activity in Oklahoma, the rise of the shale gas industry, and the shadowy operations of Russian spies. The author demonstrates how the pursuit of energy independence, fueled by fracking, created a perfect storm for both environmental damage and a weakening of democratic safeguards. Maddow begins by establishing a sense of normalcy in Oklahoma, a state undergoing a deliberate effort to rebrand itself. However, this facade of progress is disrupted by a series of strange occurrences: milkshakes thrown at McDonald's, a dinosaur's head sawed off, and a dramatic increase in earthquakes. These incidents, while bizarre on their own, become significant when viewed alongside the rapid expansion of hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, in the state. Fracking, a method of extracting natural gas, involves injecting high-pressure fluids deep underground, and Maddow suggests this process was directly linked to the escalating seismic activity. The author introduces Aubrey McClendon, the CEO of Chesapeake Energy, as a central figure in this story. McClendon embodies the ambition and excess of the fracking boom, flaunting wealth and seemingly disregarding safety concerns. Maddow details his lavish lifestyle, funded by company jets and questionable financial practices, highlighting a disregard for ethical boundaries. This unchecked power, she argues, is a symptom of a corrupted democracy where money and influence overshadow public well-being. Maddow then connects this domestic energy boom to a surprising international element: the network of Russian spies operating undercover in the United States. These illegals, trained by the KGB, were tasked with gathering intelligence, but their activities were largely ineffective and comically inept. However, their presence reveals a broader context of geopolitical maneuvering and the Russian government's interest in American energy policy. The author explains that Putin's Russia, while seemingly cooperating with the U.S. on issues like nuclear arms reduction, was simultaneously seeking to undermine American influence and maintain its own energy dominance. The narrative reveals that the Russian spies were particularly interested in gathering information about individuals connected to high-level American politicians, like Alan Patrikov, a major Democratic fundraiser. This suggests a Russian attempt to understand and potentially influence American policy decisions related to energy and foreign affairs. Maddow emphasizes that the spies' efforts were not about stealing secrets, but about understanding the inner workings of American power structures. The author points out the irony that while the U.S. was celebrating its newfound energy independence through fracking, it was simultaneously being infiltrated by Russian agents. This highlights a vulnerability in the American system, a willingness to prioritize economic gain over national security and democratic principles. Maddow suggests that the pursuit of cheap energy blinded policymakers to the potential risks, both environmental and political. Maddow underscores the disconnect between the industry's claims of safety and the reality on the ground. Despite assurances of responsible practices, fracking operations were linked to contaminated water supplies, livestock deaths, and a surge in earthquakes. The author details specific incidents, such as the spill in Pennsylvania that poisoned a family's well, illustrating the human cost of prioritizing profit over safety. The author concludes by highlighting the reluctance of scientists, like Austin Holland, to publicly challenge the industry's narrative. Holland, the state seismologist, initially hesitated to link fracking to the earthquakes, fearing repercussions from powerful energy interests. Maddow portrays this as a chilling example of how economic pressure can silence scientific expertise and compromise public trust. The story ultimately serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate power, the erosion of democratic accountability, and the complex interplay between energy, politics, and national security. Section 5. This section covers chapters 13 to 15 in the book. Rachel Maddow paints a picture of Russia in 2011, gearing up for the Winter Olympics as a country brimming with potential, fueled by a booming oil and gas industry. But beneath the shiny new stadiums, she reveals a story of how energy, wealth, and political power intertwined, creating a system ripe for corruption and a weakening of democratic principles. The Olympics weren't just about sports. They were a showcase for Russia's resurgence on the world stage, a way to signal its economic strength and political influence. The author highlights how ExxonMobil, already a hugely successful company, saw Russia as the ultimate prize. It wasn't just about finding more oil and gas. It was about tapping into a resource base controlled by a government increasingly focused on consolidating power. Rex Tillerson, ExxonMobil's CEO, understood this perfectly. He recognized that gaining access to Russia's vast reserves required more than just a good business deal. It demanded cultivating a relationship with the country's leader, Vladimir Putin. Loyalty and friendship, Maddow explains, were the currency of doing business in Russia. Tillerson's presence at the signing ceremony wasn't just a formality. It was a signal of respect and a demonstration of ExxonMobil's commitment to working with Putin's regime. Maddow details how Putin used the oil and gas industry to strengthen his grip on power, both domestically and internationally. He wasn't interested in a free and open market. He wanted to control the flow of energy and use it as a tool for political leverage. The Nord Stream and South Stream pipelines, for example, weren't simply about delivering gas to Europe. They were about bypassing countries like Ukraine and increasing Russia's influence over the continent's energy supply. Putin's strategy involved making European nations dependent on Russian energy, giving him a powerful bargaining chip in international relations. The author emphasizes the troubling pattern of Putin's government using its energy wealth to silence dissent and reward loyalty. Companies that played by the rules, like BP, faced harassment and legal challenges. Those who aligned themselves with Putin, like Rosneft, were showered with benefits and opportunities. This created a system where success wasn't based on merit or innovation, but on political connections and obedience. The raid on BP's offices, occurring the day after the ExxonMobil deal was signed, served as a clear message to other companies. Cross Putin, and you'll face consequences. Maddow introduces Igor Sechin, the head of Rosneft and a key figure in Putin's inner circle, as a ruthless and enigmatic character. She describes him as a loyal enforcer, willing to do whatever it takes to protect Putin's interests. Sechin's background in the KGB and his unwavering devotion to Putin made him the perfect gatekeeper to Russia's energy resources. He wasn't interested in fair competition or transparent business practices. He was focused on maximizing Russia's power and enriching those loyal to the regime. The author explains how Putin and Sechin viewed oil and gas not as a source of economic prosperity for the Russian people, but as a tool for restoring Russia's global prestige and asserting its dominance. They were willing to sacrifice economic efficiency and transparency in pursuit of this goal. The massive cost overruns in the Nord Stream pipeline, for example, were a result of corruption and mismanagement, but Putin didn't seem to care. The project was about demonstrating Russia's power and influence, not about maximizing profits. Maddow concludes by highlighting the dangerous alliance between Tillerson and Putin. She suggests that Tillerson, driven by the pursuit of profit, was willing to overlook the corruption and authoritarianism of Putin's regime. The deal between ExxonMobil and Rosneft wasn't just a business transaction. It was a tacit endorsement of Putin's rule and a strengthening of his power. The author implies that this partnership had far-reaching consequences, contributing to the erosion of democratic values and the rise of authoritarianism in Russia. The chapter serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate power and the corrupting influence of energy wealth. Section 6. This section covers chapters 16 to 18 in the book. Rachel Maddow paints a detailed picture of how Russia, under Vladimir Putin, aimed to become a superpower, particularly through its vast oil and gas reserves, and how that ambition intertwined with a troubling pattern of corruption and a willingness to exploit weaknesses in other countries. The chapter begins by highlighting the enormous potential of Arctic oil and gas, estimated to be around 22% of the world's undiscovered, recoverable resources. However, accessing these resources was incredibly difficult, requiring specialized technology and the ability to navigate harsh conditions. Russia possessed the necessary icebreakers, a crucial advantage, but lacked the expertise in offshore drilling itself. Maddow explains that Putin's Russia found itself in a tricky situation. While rich in resources, it needed Western oil companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron to actually extract and deliver that wealth to the global market. These Western companies were eager for the profits, but Putin's Russia presented a high-risk environment, marked by a history of questionable business practices and a government willing to strong-arm anyone who stood in its way. The author illustrates this with the example of Yukos, an oil company that was essentially dismantled after its owner challenged Putin's power. This created a climate of fear and dependence, where Western companies had to navigate a delicate balance between profit and political risk. The narrative then shifts to the United States, revealing a surprising lack of investment in icebreaking technology. While Russia built a formidable fleet, the U.S. Coast Guard struggled to maintain even a couple of functional heavy icebreakers. This disparity underscored a broader point. Russia was actively investing in its ability to control access to Arctic resources, while the U.S. seemed content to fall behind. Maddow emphasizes that this wasn't simply a matter of technological capability, but a reflection of differing priorities and a willingness to commit resources to long-term strategic goals. The author then introduces the story of Shell's ambitious, yet ultimately disastrous, attempt to drill in the Alaskan Arctic. Despite spending billions of dollars and meticulously crafting safety plans, Shell faced a series of setbacks, including equipment failures, logistical nightmares, and harsh weather conditions. Maddow details the numerous problems with Shell's drill ships, the Discoverer and the Kuluk, highlighting their age, poor maintenance, and a general lack of preparedness. The author points out that Shell's eagerness to drill, particularly in an election year for President Obama, seemed to outweigh its commitment to safety and environmental responsibility. Maddow skillfully connects Shell's struggles to a larger pattern of corruption and incompetence. The author reveals that Shell's oil spill response plan, though extensive on paper, lacked the necessary equipment and expertise to effectively handle a real disaster. The containment dome, a crucial piece of technology, proved to be faulty and unusable. This raised serious questions about whether Shell was truly prepared for the risks involved in Arctic drilling. The chapter also delves into the world of Russian espionage, revealing a surprisingly ineffective and demoralized SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, operating in the United States. Two agents, Viktor Podobny and Igor Sporoshev, spent their time complaining about their lack of success and the futility of their mission, unaware that the FBI was listening to their every conversation. This contrast between Russia's outward display of power and the internal struggles of its intelligence agencies is striking. However, while Russia's traditional spying efforts were floundering, a different kind of cyber attack was gaining momentum. The emergence of Guccifer, a Romanian hacker who breached the email accounts of prominent Americans, including members of the Bush and Clinton families, demonstrated a new and potentially more dangerous form of influence operation. Maddow explains that Guccifer's motives were unclear, but his actions had a clear impact, exposing private information and sowing discord. The author notes that Guccifer's success highlighted the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals to cyberattacks, and the ease with which sensitive information could be stolen and disseminated. Maddow connects Guccifer's activities to the broader context of Russia's growing assertiveness and its willingness to challenge the United States on multiple fronts. The author suggests that Guccifer's attacks may have been a testing ground for more sophisticated cyber operations, paving the way for the interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. The chapter concludes with the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics, a showcase of Putin's Russia and a symbol of its newfound confidence. However, the outbreak of violence in Ukraine cast a shadow over the Games, revealing the darker side of Putin's ambition and his willingness to use force to achieve his goals. Throughout the chapter, Maddow emphasizes the interconnectedness of these events. The pursuit of oil and gas wealth, the corruption within the Russian government, the vulnerabilities of democratic institutions, and the rise of cyber warfare all converged to create a complex and dangerous geopolitical landscape. The author's detailed reporting and insightful analysis offer a compelling warning about the challenges facing the United States and the world in the 21st century. Section 7. This section covers chapters 19 to 21 in the book. Rachel Maddow paints a picture of Ukraine as a country caught in a long struggle between Russia and Western powers, a tug-of-war that has lasted for nearly a century. She argues that neither side has been willing to let go of their influence over Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin especially worked hard to keep Ukraine within Russia's sphere of control, fearing the historical consequences of losing it. Ukraine declared its independence in 1990, with overwhelming support from its citizens, even in regions with large Russian-speaking populations. Maddow details a deal made in 1994 where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, the third largest stockpile in the world at the time, in exchange for promises of protection from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. This Budapest Memorandum guaranteed Ukraine's borders and sovereignty, but as the author points out, those promises proved to be unreliable. The author explains that Ukraine, newly independent and needing help, received aid from the West and cheap energy from Russia, finding itself caught between these two potential partners. The author describes a division within Ukraine itself, with Western regions leaning towards European values and Eastern regions maintaining stronger ties to Russia. This internal split made the country vulnerable to outside influence. Maddow highlights how Ukrainian politics quickly became dominated by former Soviet officials, like Leonid Kuchma and later Viktor Yanukovych, who were closely aligned with Russia. She illustrates this through examples of financial support from Putin to Ukrainian leaders, like the $56 million given to Kuchma's campaign and the $250 million sent to Kyiv under Yanukovych, often ending up in the pockets of Ukrainian oligarchs. Maddow emphasizes the deep corruption within Ukraine, exemplified by Yanukovych's illegal activities, including a scandal involving contaminated meat. She explains how Putin actively interfered in Ukrainian elections, particularly in 2004 when he supported Yanukovych and allegedly orchestrated an attempt to poison his opponent, Viktor Yushchenko. Despite the interference, Yushchenko won the election after widespread protests known as the Orange Revolution. The author then introduces Dmitry Firtash, a Ukrainian oligarch who became a key figure in Russia's strategy to control Ukraine through the energy sector. Firtash's company, Rose Ucker Energo, was given a lucrative deal to buy gas from Russia and sell it to Ukraine, siphoning off huge profits. Maddow explains how Putin used the control of natural gas as a tool to exert influence over Ukraine, creating a system of corruption that benefited Russian interests and empowered a class of Ukrainian elites dependent on Moscow. She points out that this strategy was designed to prevent the spread of democracy and Western influence in Russia's neighborhood. Maddow details how Putin's strategy evolved after Yanukovych's ouster in 2014, shifting from supporting politicians to directly controlling key industry figures and organized crime bosses. She describes the events of the Maidan Revolution, where protests against Yanukovych's pro-Russian policies led to his removal from power. This event, according to Maddow, triggered Putin's aggressive actions, including the annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in eastern Ukraine. The author explains how Putin viewed the events in Ukraine as a direct threat to Russia's interests, and a conspiracy orchestrated by the United States. She highlights the role of American figures like Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, who prioritized business deals with Russia even at the expense of U.S. foreign policy goals. Maddow illustrates how Tillerson's close relationship with Putin and his pursuit of lucrative oil and gas deals undermined efforts to counter Russian influence in Ukraine. Finally, Maddow introduces Harold Hamm, an American oil tycoon, and his influence in Oklahoma politics. She describes how Hamm used his wealth and connections to lobby for policies that benefited the oil and gas industry, even at the expense of public funding for education and infrastructure. The author uses Hamm's story to illustrate the power of special interests and the challenges of maintaining a truly democratic system. Maddow suggests that the combination of corruption, energy dependence, and powerful economic interests has created a system where democratic principles are easily compromised. Section 8. This section covers chapters 22 to 24 in the book. Rachel Maddow meticulously details a complex web connecting political power, international relations, and the energy industry, specifically focusing on Russia and the United States in 2014. The narrative reveals how a confluence of events, Russia's actions in Ukraine, the rise of fracking in America, and the ambitions of key players, created a situation ripe for questionable deals and compromised principles. Maddow illustrates how easily democratic processes can be undermined when powerful economic interests are at play. The story begins with Vladimir Putin attempting to project an image of international cooperation while simultaneously consolidating power and pursuing strategic energy goals. He sought partnerships to develop oil and gas fields in the Arctic, a region holding vast reserves but also posing significant environmental risks. This pursuit occurred against a backdrop of increasing international condemnation following Russia's annexation of Crimea. Despite this, ExxonMobil, a major American oil company, continued to collaborate with Russia's Rosneft, even as sanctions were imposed. Maddow highlights the pragmatic, profit-driven motivations of ExxonMobil, led by Rex Tillerson, who prioritized securing energy resources over political considerations. This decision, she argues, demonstrated a willingness to circumvent U.S. foreign policy for financial gain, a clear example of corrupted democracy. Maddow emphasizes the geopolitical significance of the Arctic oil reserves, framing the situation as a do-or-die climate question. Extracting these fuels would exacerbate climate change, but the economic and political advantages were deemed more important in the short term. This illustrates a troubling prioritization of immediate profits over long-term sustainability. A pattern Maddow suggests is common when powerful industries exert undue influence on governments. The author points out that Putin's Russia and ExxonMobil needed each other. Russia needed the technology and investment, while ExxonMobil needed to replenish its reserves as fracking in America began to challenge its dominance. The narrative then shifts to the internal dynamics within Russia, revealing a system where political loyalty and personal enrichment often trumped competence and sound business practices. Igor Sechin, the head of Rosneft, is portrayed as a ruthless figure who built his empire through aggressive tactics and corruption. Maddow details how Sechin used his influence to seize assets from competitors, often with the backing of Putin, demonstrating a disregard for fair business practices and the rule of law. The author explains that Russia's energy industry, while vast, was becoming inefficient and reliant on government bailouts, highlighting the dangers of a state-controlled economy driven by personal gain. Maddow further illustrates the corruption by detailing the case of Vladimir Yevtushenkov, a Russian billionaire whose oil company was effectively stolen by the state under Sechin's direction. This example showcases how the Kremlin could target successful entrepreneurs who didn't align with its interests, sending a chilling message to the business community. The author notes that the seizure of Yevtushenkov's assets occurred alongside the pursuit of the Arctic oil deal with ExxonMobil. suggesting a coordinated effort to consolidate power and control over Russia's energy resources. The tragic downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine served as a turning point, prompting stronger international sanctions against Russia. However, even these sanctions were not enough to completely derail the ExxonMobil-Rosneft partnership. Maddow points out that ExxonMobil was granted a temporary waiver to continue its Arctic drilling operations, raising questions about the effectiveness of the sanctions and the influence of the company's lobbying efforts. The author suggests that the U.S. government was hesitant to fully disrupt a deal that was seen as strategically important, even in the face of Russia's aggressive actions. Maddow concludes by highlighting the complex and often contradictory motivations of the key players involved. Putin was driven by a desire to restore Russia's global influence and control its energy resources. ExxonMobil was focused on maximizing profits and securing its long-term energy supply. And the U.S. government was caught in a difficult position, trying to balance its geopolitical interests with its commitment to democratic values. The author's detailed account reveals a disturbing pattern of compromised principles, questionable deals, and the erosion of democratic norms in the pursuit of energy and power. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate influence and the importance of holding powerful actors accountable. Section 9. This section covers chapters 25 to 27 in the book. Rachel Maddow details a complex story of how Russia, under Vladimir Putin, intentionally tried to mess with American democracy, and how that effort is deeply connected to oil and gas money. It all started to become clear in 2014, when signs emerged that Harold Hamm, a big oil executive, was trying to downplay his own role in building his company, Continental Resources. Maddow explains this wasn't about ego, but about a messy divorce. Hamm didn't have a prenuptial agreement, and his wife, Sue Ann, was potentially in line for a huge payout, possibly billions of dollars. To lessen the amount she could claim, Hamm's lawyers began to remove mentions of his personal success from the company's official records. This seemingly private legal battle reveals a larger pattern. Maddow shows how Putin's Russia operates, by controlling resources, specifically oil and gas, and using that control to achieve political goals. Russia's economy is heavily reliant on oil and gas revenue, but Putin's leadership has led to corruption and a lack of economic diversity. This created a situation where Russia needed to find other ways to exert influence, and that's where interfering with other countries' democracies came into play. The author explains that Putin's Russia wasn't trying to conquer the world, but to create chaos and undermine trust in democratic institutions. The story takes a turn when Maddow describes the first International Russian Conservative Forum in 2015. This gathering, filled with far-right and nationalist groups from around the world, was essentially a showcase for Putin's influence. The forum was a strange mix of fringe characters, and it highlighted Russia's willingness to support anyone who challenged Western values. Maddow points out that even though the event wasn't well attended, it signaled a broader strategy to exploit divisions within other countries and weaken their governments. Central to this strategy was the Internet Research Agency, a Russian troll farm that created fake social media accounts and spread disinformation. Maddow details how these trolls targeted Americans with divisive messages, aiming to sow discord and distrust. They created fake personas, posed as Americans, and amplified existing political tensions. For example, they stirred up controversy around issues like immigration, gun control, and race, often supporting extreme viewpoints. The author emphasizes that this wasn't just about supporting Donald Trump. It was about undermining faith in the entire democratic process. Maddow explains that Russia's actions weren't simply about political preference. They were driven by a need to protect Putin's power and Russia's economic interests. Sanctions imposed by the West after Russia's annexation of Crimea hurt Russia's oil and gas industry, limiting access to crucial technology and investment. This economic pressure motivated Putin to retaliate by trying to destabilize the United States and other Western countries. The author notes that Putin saw a weakened West as a way to lessen the pressure on Russia and maintain his grip on power. The author highlights the interconnectedness of these events. The attempt to manipulate a divorce case, the support for extremist groups, the disinformation campaigns, and the economic motivations all tie back to Putin's strategy. Maddow argues that Russia's actions are a direct result of its reliance on oil and gas, its corrupt political system, and Putin's desire to maintain control. The author concludes that Russia's interference in American democracy wasn't just a one-time event, but a deliberate and ongoing effort to undermine the foundations of a free and open society. It's a story about how a country's economic and political weaknesses can be weaponized to threaten the stability of the world. Section 10. This section covers chapters 28 to 29 in the book. Rachel Maddow paints a detailed picture of how the oil and gas industry, Russia, and American democracy have become tangled together in a way that threatens how our government works. The story begins with the tragic death of Aubrey McClendon, a powerful oil executive, shortly after being indicted for illegally working with others to control the price of oil and gas leases. Maddow suggests his death wasn't a simple accident, hinting at a possible suicide driven by the legal trouble he faced. This sets the stage for a deeper look at the industry's willingness to bend, and sometimes break, the rules to get ahead. Maddow explains how McClendon's company, Chesapeake Energy, became a symbol of the boom and bust cycle of fracking, a way to get oil and gas from underground. While he was celebrated for bringing big changes to Oklahoma City, like new sports arenas and hospitals, the author points out the hidden costs. The state government gave Chesapeake and other companies a lot of breaks, which eventually led to problems like earthquakes caused by the way they disposed of wastewater and a shrinking budget for schools. This illustrates a key theme: the industry's power to influence government decisions, often at the expense of the public good. The author then dives into how the oil and gas industry uses its money to influence politics. She notes the huge amounts of money they donate to political campaigns, overwhelmingly favoring Republican candidates. This isn't just about supporting friendly politicians. It's about buying influence and ensuring that regulations stay weak. Maddow highlights how, after Donald Trump was elected, one of the first things Congress did was overturn a rule requiring oil and gas companies to disclose payments made to foreign governments. This rule was meant to fight corruption, but the industry opposed it, arguing it would put them at a disadvantage. Maddow connects this back to Russia, explaining how the Trump administration's actions benefited Russian interests. She details how individuals with close ties to Russia, like Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, were appointed to key positions. She also discusses the numerous contacts between Trump campaign officials and Russian individuals who offered help with lifting sanctions against Russia. These sanctions were put in place because of Russia's actions in Ukraine and other countries, and lifting them would have been a major win for Russian oil and gas companies. The author points out that Russia's desire to get rid of sanctions was a central theme in many of these interactions. The author emphasizes that Russia's involvement wasn't just about helping Trump win the election. It was about protecting its economic interests, particularly in the oil and gas sector. She explains how Russian companies, like Rosneft, were eager to partner with American companies, but sanctions made those deals difficult. Maddow details how individuals connected to Putin tried to influence the Trump campaign to ease those restrictions. She also notes that the Trump administration actively worked to weaken regulations and promote fossil fuel production, which benefited both American and Russian energy companies. Maddow argues that the oil and gas industry operates on a principle of self-preservation, prioritizing profit above all else. She compares it to a lion hunting a gazelle, suggesting that it's simply in their nature to exploit resources and influence governments. She points out that the industry has a long history of supporting authoritarian regimes and resisting regulations that would protect the environment or promote transparency. The author stresses that relying on the industry to act responsibly on its own is unrealistic. However, Maddow offers a glimmer of hope, pointing to Oklahoma as an example of how citizens can fight back. After years of cuts to education funding, teachers in Oklahoma went on strike, demanding more money for schools. This pressure forced the state legislature to raise taxes on oil and gas production, providing much-needed funding for education. This demonstrates that when people organize and demand change, even the most powerful industries can be held accountable. Maddow concludes by arguing that it's crucial to regulate the oil and gas industry and hold it accountable for its actions. She calls for greater transparency, stricter environmental regulations, and an end to subsidies that encourage fossil fuel production. She believes that democracy is at stake and that we must actively protect it from the corrupting influence of the oil and gas industry. The author suggests that while the fight will be difficult, it's essential for the future of our planet and our government. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.